Right, hi everyone, I'm Mike Burrows, and well done everybody for passing the initiative test and actually finding the room. It did take me a little while. I had to ask somebody. So I'm going to talk about how organisations scale and do it in a way that's perhaps not what you're used to. So this isn't scale in terms of how do we make process bigger and more complicated, which unfortunately is what a lot of people think about when they talk about scaling, or think about when they're thinking about scaling, and instead about what's fundamentally happening in organizations and how we can actually make that work better, make that work more effectively if we're pursuing business agility, those kinds of outcomes for our organization. Now I'm going to start with a story. It begins in about 2008. If you cast your mind back to then, that's about in the middle of the credit crisis. And at the time, I was the global development manager for fixed income securities, bonds in other words, for a leading investment bank. In the middle of the credit crisis, clearly the most intense part of my whole career. It was a crazy ride. Now, the bank I worked for, it did particularly badly. And I want to tell just in a few sentences, a little bit of that story. They decided they needed a little bit of help with strategy. They got some advice, and the advice was, after doing a benchmarking exercise, you're not doing enough in US mortgage-backed securities. Yeah, so I think you can probably see what's coming. Actually, you don't see the half of it. So yes, of course, they grew their business in the States. It's a European bank, but they grew their business in the States in US mortgage-backed securities. But they thought they'd go one step further than that. They didn't just deliver, they delivered with enthusiasm. Treasury in Zurich sold their gold bars and bought, you guessed it, US mortgage-backed securities. This was while other parts of the bank, in particular the research department, was actually telling the bank's clients, don't touch this stuff, it's toxic. So what do we have? We have a strategy that's enthusiastically held, enthusiastically delivered, but fighting against that, an assurance function or various assurance functions that didn't really have a voice. When the final reckoning was done, they lost $50 billion. I have to say that number again, $50 billion, an absolutely extraordinary amount of money, an amount that would have killed most banks. Now, fortunately, they survived. And 2 years ago, UBS, which is the bank concerned, actually took over Credit Suisse. So two national champions became one integrated bank. So quite an extraordinary story. And in a way, it's the survival that's more interesting than the catastrophe. I know we all love catastrophe stories, but the survival is much more interesting. And what we're going to do with this model is to make it much more about survival. And this is actually something that's been studied for decades. We are studying what are called viable organizations. And when I say a viable organization, I don't just mean the whole corporation. I also mean the divisions inside it, the departments. I ran a department, teams, and anything in between. Viable organizations and scopes thereof. If you identify with a scope of an organization or multiple scopes of an organization and it does some useful work, then the model applies. So what is a viable organization? Those that work on their capacity for independent action in a changing environment. Now, I borrowed this definition from John Boyd. That's very much after John Boyd. He of Øredev fame, you might remember him. John Boyd, if you remember, was a fighter pilot. Run out of options as a fighter pilot, and it's game over. And it's the same also for organizations. It's the same for teams. You may have noticed when teams get nervous, when they see the backlog dry up, and they feel like they're running out of options. That's actually a very healthy response. So what do viable organizations pay attention to? They pay attention to staying in the game when the game may be changing, keeping them supplied with options, keeping healthy. You know, they don't want to have their great ideas undermined by sources of unhealthiness and dysfunction and so on. And again, after John Boyd, always having options. But strategy, delivery, assurance, that doesn't quite cut it, does it? The first part of my story told, it's not enough to have a strategy. It's not enough to have a strategy. Even a strategy that's good today might not be a good one tomorrow. So let's make some changes to this model. Delivery becomes delivering, discovering, renewing. And this is something that really has changed, or at least our understanding has changed over the last 50 years since these kinds of ideas were first being explored. We know in knowledge work, in product development work, in technology development work, and so on, that delivering, discovering, renewing are completely integrated, or they need to be integrated. We don't just discover as a prerequisite to delivering, we deliver in order to discover. And we are renewing our capabilities, cleaning up our code, developing ourselves as an organization, as people, and so on, as part of that process. As I said already, it's not enough to have a strategy. We need to be adaptive strategizing adaptively. You could say that's guiding that process, making sure that we always do have those options, understanding how the game is changing and responding appropriately. Assurance becomes mutual trust building. That's helping the organization be more trusting, more trustworthy. That has effect, for example, of giving people the context they need to make good decisions, where the more operational side of delivering, discovering, renewing understands the strategic side and vice versa. Now, it turns out that these elements are so intimately related, they share some structure. I call them the three spaces of the delivery adaptive organization. And they get their structure from a very interesting source, a very respected but also quite intimidating source, it should be said, the viable system model, which was developed by Stafford Beer in the 1970s. That picture on the left, well, I'm going to cross it out in a moment, but let's just make it so you can see it. It was the safe poster of its day. I'm quite sure, I know this from talking to people, that it's put off more people than it has engaged. And some of you, if you know what I've been doing for the last 10 years, I'm in the business of engagement, of participation, of invitation, generative change, those kinds of things. And we have to do better than the picture like this if we want to engage people. So I've been working very hard on how to present this differently. Now, the detail of this isn't of concern in today's talk. We'll get into more of that tomorrow. We're thinking particularly about the scale-related issues. But one thing I've done for a model that can apply to anything from an amoeba up to an industrial economy, I have to give its components names that make sense in a digital age organization, in an organization pursuing business agility. So we've got the value-creating work, you'll recognize that, coordinating, organizing, strategizing, self-governing, contextualizing, all essential elements of any viable organization, any deliberately adaptive organization of any scale. I call this verbing the nouns of business agility, by the way. As I said before, it's not enough to have a strategy, we need to be strategizing. It's not enough to have a coordination system, to have an organization structure. We need to be organizing. So emphasizing the fact that these are ongoing activities. We need to do better than that picture. So these three spaces organize some of that detail. We're not so concerned about that level of detail today, more on that tomorrow. But think about this as a model, a fractal model, a model for every scale of organization, for every level of scale of organization. And perhaps more interesting philosophically, not just a model of the organization, but a model of your experience of the organization. And that philosophical difference actually has practical implications, which again we'll explore tomorrow. But on the topic of engagement, participation, generative change, and so on, it has to start with things that are real people's experience. I think I have a question coming.
Every level, do you mean even at the team level?
Even at the team level, team of teams, or even smaller than teams, sub-team. If you identify with it and it does useful work, the model applies. Yeah. So, with a model of every scale of organization, in a way that's very difficult unless you've got a magnifying glass with the Stafford Beers picture, we can start to untangle the strands. What's happening between different levels of scale of organisation? So from the front, structuring, translating, reconciling, connected. Structuring, making sure that we're attending to the different structures, that they're in healthy relationship with each other. So the structures of our work, the structure of our organisation, the structure of the business environment that we relate to. If those structures don't fit well, you're going to have a problem. And the fact is that our environment's changing, our challenges are changing over time as well. So this becomes a dynamic process. That's why it's structuring, not structure. Translating. Now, the language of the team is different to the language of the board. So contrary to the people that says that everyone in the organisation must speak the same language, that's actually not true. Now, there are times when language is a source of confusion and there should be some clarification. But in general, different levels of organisation work at different levels of abstraction to different timelines. Some are focused on technology, for example. Some are focused on finance. Some are focused on people. Those are different domains of knowledge, and each domain of knowledge has its own language. From lower level to higher level, from team to team of teams, you'll have high level goals, for example. Again, some translation required. Reconciling, that works horizontally as well as vertically, but that's making sure that our plans, our commitments, our strategies are coherent with each other. Now, you might think of this as alignment, but alignment to me doesn't feel rich enough, complex enough, nuanced enough. In an organisation where there's self-organising and innovation, resilience, all these different things happening at every scale of organisation, just aligning on one goal, for example, as some people would have you believe, doesn't to me feel rich enough. And connecting, as I said before, building a more trusting organisation, a more trustworthy organisation, an organisation in which people have the context they need to make good decisions, whether they are operational decisions or strategic decisions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take those 4 strands and play them against a familiar model of scale, familiar to at least, who was in Annette's talk just now? I know Annette was, I've just seen Annette, but who else? There's a few, yes, there's Annette. So I'm going to borrow, I'm representing it slightly differently to Annette, but it's essentially the same model. It's from a friend of mine, Klaus Leopold, and his model is called Flight Levels, and it's from his book, Rethinking Agile. So we've got teams able to deliver independently, teams that have identity. They are, by my definition, viable organisations, deliberately adaptive organisations. Teams might work with other teams and form a value stream, so the value stream as a whole also fulfills that same definition. All the value streams of the organisation together make up flight level 1 operations. Yeah, makes sense? And I've worked in organisations where a lot of self-management happened, and a lot of work was done just by teams talking to each other. I've worked in major, what are called front-to-back projects in banks, where there was no project manager at all, it was teams talking to each other. And it's amazing how much you can achieve like that. But sometimes you do need a level of overall coordination so that the right things get started at the right time so that they finish at the right time. That can't be done by the teams themselves. Something else that can't be done by the teams themselves or that coordination level is making sure that we have the right level, right mix of work overall, that we have the right risk profile, and so on, and so on, and so on. So that gives you flight level 3 strategic portfolio management. So the issue now, what happens when you're feeling some pain at some part of this structure, some part of this process? Is it a local problem that can be fixed locally? Or is it, to use a medical analogy, is it referred pain? Are you feeling pain somewhere different from where the source, the root of that pain is? Is it a problem of scale rather than a problem of practice, is one way you might express that. So we'll go through these strands one at a time, structuring, translating, reconciling, connecting, and for each of those, I'll give you one dysfunction of several I could have chosen from that corresponds to those strands. And I promise you, you will recognize at least one of the dysfunctions, if not the majority, if not all of them. They're all familiar things. So let's start with structuring. Remember, structuring is about the structures of the work, of the organization, of the environment being compatible with each other. And the problem I've got here, the dysfunction I call the hole in the whole product. You can tell I'm a writer, can't you? The hole in the whole product. And to give you an idea of massive, massive scale, the example I'm going to use is your healthcare system. Now, I don't know the exact details of how healthcare works in Sweden, but I imagine it's very similar to how it works in the UK. And the way I'm going to slice this up is using this really nice model. It's from a friend of mine, Patrick Hoverstadt, and it goes customer, geography, technology, time. And if you're a question person, which I am, who, where, what, when. So let's think about healthcare services in the round for Sweden, for the UK. There are two kinds of customer. There are those whose healthcare is provided for by the state. There is those who pay for their own healthcare directly or through an insurance company. So at least in the UK, you have public and private medicine. Is it the same in Sweden? I'm getting some nods. I think it works in most of the developed world. And whether that includes the United States is perhaps open for debate, but most of the developed world, that's how it works. Right, geography, where are they? Where do they occur? I'm referring to where do those needs occur? But actually the health service responds to location in a very interesting way. You have some healthcare professionals who will come to your house. You have local clinics, local hospitals, bigger hospitals, teaching hospitals. In the UK, we have regional trauma centres, where the helicopters go, national centres of excellence, and so on. And the issue is, we all want healthcare to be local, but we can't all have an MRI scanner in our in our garage. It doesn't work. So there's this tension between locality, but also concentration of capital equipment, top-level expertise, and stuff like that. And that's something that the design of the organisation has to deal with. Whose needs should we be meeting? Technology. Walk into a hospital, and all the signs of the different departments, a lot of them seem to correspond to different parts of the human body, don't they? Cardiology, neurology, and whatever. Not all of them, but many of them. And the hospital is organised so that for most people, when they come to hospital, their needs are going to be served by one department. That breaks down for a small minority of cases where you have complex conditions. I know all about complex conditions, not going to go into that now. But for most people, you visit one particular department in hospital. One particular hospital consultant will take care of you. And then there's time. When do those needs occur? And this is a really fascinating dimension. Think about the time in terms of our relationship with the healthcare system, first of all. And there's a life cycle that goes from before we were born to after we die. We've got fertility, maternity, neonatal, pediatric, general adult medicine, geriatric medicine, pathology. Diseases have a life cycle. Detection, diagnosis, treatment, rehabilitation, monitoring, so on and so on. The accident and emergency department, the A&E department, or the emergency department, as we're increasingly calling it now, you never know when you're going to need the emergency department. Any time, day or night, 7 days a week. And the hospital needs to organise for that. It needs to organise people in shifts and so on. So that time dimension, in different ways, the patient life cycle, the disease life cycle, the episodic nature of some diseases has a big effect on how the organisation is organised. And let's translate that into product terms now. When we're reaching the right customers, meeting their strategic needs, helping them make meaningful progress, who are they? Whose needs are we meeting? Where are they? Where do those needs occur? Or where are they when those needs occur? What needs should we be meeting? I call these strategic needs. Their needs, our strategy, and when do they occur? And we have a hole in our whole product when across the life cycle of our relationship with the organisation, or the customer's relationship with a product organisation or with a service organisation, we aren't meeting needs. We aren't meeting the needs of people who don't even know about you yet. You're not meeting the needs of those that have come to find out what you're about. Not meeting the needs of the new customer, of the experienced customer, of the champion. You have a hole in your whole product if when you slice up the market in terms of customer geography and technology, and also look at it in terms of that life cycle, that there's a gap that you need to fill. Now, you may, in the long run, need to fill that by actually organising a team around that particular gap. But my advice to you first, I never advise wholesale reorganisation as a first step. Apologies if that disappoints some of you, but I never advise that. Start by monitoring whether customers are being successful in that area. So that has an effect on things like the metrics that you use, on roles like customer success people, and so on and so on. Start there and then work backwards. Decide what needs aren't you serving well enough. Think about how you respond to that, whether that involves a team or whether you can do something a bit more exploratory, a bit more iterative with the team structure that you have already. So that's dysfunction one, the hole in the whole product. I have a question.
Just wondering, do you start with the realization that you have a hole in the whole product, or do you use this to analyze it before?
Bit of both, to be honest. So you can literally try to segment your market by customer geography, technology in particular. When you've got a good idea of your market segmentation, also look at the life cycle aspects as well. So it may turn out that you're weak on the early stages of the life cycle in a country, for example. You're weak on the support side for a particular kind of customer or whatever it might be. So yeah, a bit of both. I'll move on. So problem two is in the area of translating. So translating, as I said, the language of the team, the language of the board is different. Inevitably, there must be some translation between levels of organisation. What we're mostly talking about here is translating progress and issues. And I'm going to focus mainly on progress. So we've got work, I'm using Kanban, not because I'm selling you Kanban, just because it's nice and visual, but we've got our sticky notes moving across the wall at one level. What does that mean for the higher level? How do we design? The question you might be wanting to ask urgently is, well, how do we design the work management system for that next highest level? If that's your question, I recommend you read Klaus's book or talk to Annette or something. I'm going to ask a slightly different question. I'll give you some slightly different advice. And that is, before you do that, explore means and ends. And by that, I mean, what is the so that of the work that you're doing? With a user story or a job story or something, there's the so that at the end that says why we are doing what we're doing. What does success look like for the customer? Understand the context for that. What is the situation of struggle, of need that piece of work is responding to? How do we then know that the customer is making progress? So we deliver this work, then what happens? Why is that important? And so on and so on. We start to identify indicators of customer success with a bit more questioning. Those questions and questions like what happens before, where does that come from? We might divide them into leading indicators we can act on, lagging indicators that tell us that we're being successful. And it may turn out that just looking at those indicators at the high level is what is the main thing that you need to be doing. With one caveat. If your metrics at the higher level are no different to the metrics at the lower level, what is that higher level doing? What value is it actually adding? Just leave that naughty thought there and move on to some more dysfunctions. So confusing ends and means is a very common problem, and we've all come across developers who think it's their job to get to code complete. Come across product owners, product managers who think their job is to add features to products. Confusing ends and means. The next one is willing the ends but not the means. That's a dysfunction that sets teams up for failure. The higher level asks for something that the team isn't resourced to deliver. Micromanaging, that's the higher level taking too much interest in the how of the lower level. That is, at a human level, extremely destructive behaviour. At a more sort of functional level, that's taking away your capacity to even think about the ends. You're just being told how to do the means. Very, very destructive behaviour. I've been very fortunate in my career. I've only worked once for a micromanager. I can tell you I hated every minute of it. And I was the opposite. I also replaced a micromanager, which is interesting. Now, I had a queue of people at my desk asked me what to do on the day one of me arriving in this new job. I said, you're going to make me unhappy and you unhappy if we continue like this. And we worked out how to make the work more self-managing, more self-organising. Responsibilities in the wrong place. This is a way project managers get set up for failure sometimes. You make the project manager responsible for the business success, where they don't actually have adequate power over the business situation at the high level in order to actually deliver that success. Maybe it's their fault for selling the benefits in the first place. That's another story. So that was translating. Reconciling, remember, this is about more trusting and trustworthy organisation and about people having the context for making decisions, operational decisions or strategic decisions, and I'm going to focus on that aspect more than anything. So we've been surprised. So the dysfunction is we're dealing poorly with surprise. If you're a mathematician, which is my background, if you've been exposed to information theory, you'll know that surprise and information are almost the same thing. At least to a mathematician, they're almost the same thing. So you could say an organisation that deals poorly with surprise deals poorly with information. So I'll just leave that hanging as we explore this a bit more. So you're surprised by a piece of work that you weren't expecting, a requirement you weren't expecting, whether it's come on from on high, or whether it's come as a demand from outside, or worse, you've got to the end of the process and the response to the piece of work that you thought was amazing was one of disappointment. Now, how do you deal with that? Well, what I'm going to suggest to you is there's a ladder you can climb. There are judgment calls to be made at every step of the ladder. I'm not telling you whether it's right or wrong to climb or to stay where you are. That's for you to decide. But a lot of these things is about developing judgment, developing gut feeling, and so on. There will always be a place for these things. There will always be more work to be done than you can possibly do. So it's important that you do make those judgment calls. So one possibly correct thing to do might be just to ignore that information. The customer wants the buttons to be green and not blue. Well, who cares? They're one of 1,000 customers. It doesn't matter. We'll ignore it. Or you might decide, well, actually, okay, well, making the button green doesn't cost us very much. We'll just do it. You might decide to share that information. Perhaps this information is important to the team next to you. Perhaps we should even have a conversation, upstairs, so to speak. Is this something that we should worry about more widely? We'll strategize. We'll come up with some ideas. We'll reconcile our different ideas so that what we do and what our neighbour teams do, that those responses are coherent. We'll structure an overall response. Perhaps it's one that where we do the work only in one place. For example, we have a more efficient response, and we organise around the commitment that we've made. Now, what I've just described to you is a very weird way of looking at what teams are really good at. Teams are very good at responding to surprise, to self-organising when something's not right, and so on and so on. Teams do it every day. The issue happens higher up the organisation. It's much easier to stay at the lower levels. It's much easier to hope that information doesn't even get to you. And to an extent, that's actually not a bad thing. You don't want the upper reaches of your organisation to be overwhelmed with noise from underneath. So again, there's this issue of judgment here. Organisations are understandably, but sometimes to their detriment, reluctant to commit to changes that have any impact on the structure. And if you want a resilient and innovative organisation, you have to be ready to make changes at the appropriate time. That doesn't mean that you just get blown around by the wind, but you do need to know which way the wind is blowing, if I can put it like that. So dealing better with surprise, self-organising at scale, and it's all part of this process of making sure that what we are doing, what the next guy is doing, what the guys above and below us are doing, that they are coherent with each other. Not necessarily 100% aligned, but at least coherent. And the last of the four is connecting. So that's dealing with these failures of context, building trust, making the organisation more trusting and trustworthy. And And again, we've been surprised, and we're now looking back on that surprise, wondering what on earth went wrong. Perhaps we decide there's a particular stage in the process where it went wrong. And the question is, why did we make that decision? What is the context that we didn't have in order to make that decision? And one very interesting way to think about this in a bit more deeper way is to divide the process into two halves. Rather than blame that particular activity, the people who were involved at that stage of the process, think in terms of upstream and downstream. Is this a healthy and productive relationship? Or is it one suffers from a sort of, uber dysfunction here? One side doing what might better be done by the other, or in collaboration, or deferred until needed. So, for example, and it's a common case, there was a conversation that didn't happen, or there's a collaboration that didn't happen. And it's good to think about the beginning of the process, those conversations you have before you properly start the work. Conversations where as a team you understand what's involved. What is the commitment that we're making as a team? And you can ask yourself, for this particular piece of work, do we coordinate, cooperate, or collaborate? Do we just let the board, our systems, our stand-up meetings, our scrum, whatever it is that we use, are those coordination systems going to be enough to get us to the end successfully? And for a lot of work, the answer is probably yes. Then there will be work that demands cooperation. We need to understand this better. We need to break it down. We need to agree where we're going to synchronize, all those kind of things. These are special to that piece of work. And then there's the collaboration. We need something more creative. That's what when I think of collaboration, I always think of a creative relationship, Crick and Watson, Lennon and McCartney, or something like that. It's not just playing nicely with each other. It's something creative, and where also there's the risk of failure as well. We don't know exactly how this thing is going to work out. And we're preparing ourselves, those that are doing the work and the wider team, for the fact that what we try might not actually have the exact outcome that we expect. So for each piece of work, do we coordinate, cooperate, collaborate? And this is a great conversation because it's a sense-making conversation. You can't answer that question without having at least some idea of what's involved. You're making some better sense of the work. Using the word sense-making quite deliberately, it might put you in mind of this famous picture. Here's the Cynefin framework. So is this a piece of work where we just need to coordinate and everything will just work? That's clear. Do we need to cooperate, break it down, work out our integration points and so on? We cooperate. Complex, those are the areas where we need to collaborate. Some creative aspect needs to be discovered. Solutions we don't know yet. Likely to see some failure. We're likely going to need to iterate and so on. As for chaotic or that funny area in the middle, if we don't know where to start, it's probably not time to start this piece of work yet. We probably do need to break it down. We need to understand it better. Don't start a piece of work you don't understand, unless the work is just to understand it better. So trust-building conversations, sense-making conversations, and a bit of Cynefin there to be thrown in. And lastly, at the end, at your retrospective, this is the next retrospective now. This isn't where you're considering the failures, but just think, in general, or when you're going through each piece of work, did we coordinate, cooperate, collaborate appropriately? Did we choose the right one? As you go down that list, they get more and more expensive. To collaborate on something that only needed coordination, for example, you are paying a price, and it may not have been justified. And you're improving your gut feel, your sense of smell for complexity in that way. Right. And the takeaway here, become a keeper of context. I always used to say, be a keeper of context, and people used to ask why I was talking about beekeeping. So it's now become a keeper of context. This doesn't mean you need to have all the answers. It does mean you need to recognize when there's some context that is missing. And what it actually is an opportunity to work backwards, work right to left, so to speak, work backwards to the collaboration that didn't happen, the conversation that didn't happen. Did we have the right people there at the beginning of the piece of work? Is this actually a scaling issue? Are there representatives of the wider organisation that need to be involved in that conversation as part of our stand-up meeting or a separate meeting that we schedule for that purpose? Let's not start what we can't finish. Or put it even more strongly than that, don't start what you can't finish. And those early conversations can be absolutely crucial to that. So just to wrap up, there are relationships everywhere. There are those horizontal relationships of your process, between stages in the process, between states of the work. You can think of each handover as being a relationship. I think it's much more interesting to think about the bigger relationship between all that went before and all that went after. Is that a healthy and productive relationship? Are we collaborating, coordinating, cooperating, whatever order that is, appropriately? Also, those vertical relationships with those four strands, structuring, translating, reconciling, connecting, with all the scope for dysfunction that exists in each of them. So this is I'm overlaying on process a non-processy way of thinking about organisation. It's an organisational way of thinking about scaling. And we can reflect on this, have generative conversations about it. Imagine these relationships in healthy and productive balance with each other. Every relationship helping those it relates to achieve their full potential. Every element contributing to the success of the whole. And then it says ideal obstacles outcomes. That's shorthand for something I'll expand on tomorrow. But you can imagine that working at its best, at its ideal best. You can enjoy that on your own, you can reflect on it on your own, you can have a conversation, an energizing conversation with your colleagues about it working at its ideal best. Then what stops that? What's in the way of that? We're exploring possibility. And what's in the way of possibility? This is like to the keynote this morning, this is to infinity and beyond stuff. Then what's beyond those obstacles, the outcomes? Organise those outcomes, they're coherent by construction. We've got a strategy here, and from those we're working on those with different ideas, different interventions, just to begin to bring those about. Other kinds of relationships between spaces, relationships inside each space, dig into those tomorrow. Relationships between levels of scale, which we've been focusing on today. Relationships between people and your networks plural. You can think of each space representing a network as well. The web of organisational scopes, I think the scopes that need to act coherently, have coherent strategies. So that reconciling thing was about, but are those relationships healthy and productive? So just to finish, start where you are, from your scopes, the scopes with which you identify. If you identify with the scope and it does useful work, then this applies. In your networks, at the scales you best understand, scales plural, you're looking at the relationship between scales, structuring, translating, reconciling, connecting. So structuring who, where, what, when, or customer, geography, technology, time if you prefer. Translating ends before means. Reconciling self-organisation at every scale. Are you actually listening to the wind, realising when you're not quite structured right? The relationship between how your work is structured, how you are structured, and how your business environment is structured, and where your challenges are coming from, there's something not quite right about those. And connecting, become a keeper of context. Notice when people don't have it. I really do need to finish. So this is in more detail in my most recent book, Wholehearted, Engaging with Complexity in a Deliberately Adaptive Organisation. In a way, I wrote the book so I could talk about the scaling stuff because I just didn't find it anywhere else. The theory has existed since the 1970s, but no one seems to have thought to tease those layers apart and look what's happening in between. Now the book has become a lot more than that, but that genuinely was one of my motivations for writing it. Best place for the book is Amazon. That's where the 5-star reviews are. And there's a page, amazon.com slash, not amazon.com, agendashift.com /keynote/scaling. There's various links to articles that relate to this talk, things you can download, and so on. And I have finished with 1 minute left, so I could possibly take a question or two. You've had 2 questions already, so someone else. Looks like we're done. I have finished on time, so good. Thank you very much. Well done for finding the room, and thank you.